The house was a relic, perched at the edge of a sprawling meadow in the heart of the countryside. My grandmother's home was a place of faded wallpaper, creaky floorboards, and an unsettling stillness that lingered in the air. It was a house that held secrets, though Grandma never spoke of them. She was a quiet woman, sharp-eyed and deliberate, with hands hardened by decades of work. I had always loved visiting her as a child. The house had a charm, a rustic beauty that seemed untouched by time. But there was one thing that always bothered me. The floor plan didn't add up. I first noticed it when I was 8 years old. Grandma had asked me to fetch something from her room upstairs. As I climbed the narrow staircase, my hand trailing along the smooth wooden banister, I counted the doors in the hallway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But there should have been 6. Grandma, I had asked when I returned, why is there a room missing upstairs? She paused, her face darkening ever so slightly, before brushing the question aside. There's no missing room, sweetheart. Don't let your imagination run wild. But my curiosity refused to die. As I grew older, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. The house had 5 visible rooms upstairs, but something about the layout felt wrong. Hallways seemed longer than they should be. Walls felt too thin, as if there was something on the other side. And on quiet nights, I could swear I heard faint noises, muffled whispers and distant footsteps, emanating from somewhere they shouldn't. It was years later, after Grandma passed away, that I found myself standing in front of her house once more. The meadow was overgrown, the house weathered and forlorn. I had inherited the property, but stepping inside felt like trespassing. The smell of dust and aged wood greeted me as I pushed open the front door. The furniture was just as I remembered. The threadbare armchair by the fireplace, the oak dining table with its scuffed legs, and the clock on the mantel that had stopped ticking long ago. But the house felt different now, emptier and yet heavier. I spent the first day sorting through Grandma's belongings. Her possessions were modest, but each item carried a weight of memory. Among them, I found her journal. It was an unassuming leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with time. Curiosity piqued. I began to read. Most of the entries were mundane, accounts of daily chores, visits from neighbors, and notes about the weather. But as I flipped through, I came across a passage that made my blood run cold. The room is always there, even though it shouldn't be. I don't know why, and I've long since stopped trying to understand it. It is not for us to see, not for us to enter. The house protects us in its own way, but the balance is delicate. If anyone finds it, if anyone opens it, I fear for what might come through. My heart raced as I reread the words. Could she be talking about the 6th room? I skimmed through the rest of the journal, searching for more clues. There were cryptic hints scattered throughout. Mentions of strange noises, unsettling dreams, and shadows that moved on their own. That night, as I lay in the guest bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching me. Sleep was elusive, and when it finally came, it was filled with nightmares. I dreamt of a dark hallway stretching endlessly, and at the end of it, a door, red old and pulsing like it was alive. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Armed with a tape measure and a notebook, I began meticulously measuring the upstairs floor plan. Sure enough, the dimensions didn't add up. There was a gap, a space that should have been a room, but wasn't. It was as I stood in the upstairs hallway, staring at the wall where the room should be, that I noticed something strange. The wallpaper was different here. It was subtle, but the pattern didn't quite match the rest of the hallway. My hand brushed against it, and to my astonishment, the wall gave a hollow sound. Heart pounding, I searched the house for tools. In the attic, I found an old crowbar, its metal rusted but still sturdy. Returning to the hallway, I pried at the edges of the wallpaper. To my shock, a hidden door began to reveal itself, its surface scarred and ancient. It wasn't just a door, it was a boundary. For hours, I stared at the door, debating whether to open it. Grandma's warning echoed in my mind, but my curiosity was insatiable. Finally, as dusk settled over the house, I made my decision. With trembling hands, I turned the doorknob. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it the scent of decay. The room beyond was dark, impossibly dark, as if light itself was swallowed by the void. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it inside. What I saw defied explanation. The room was wrong. The walls were covered in shifting patterns, as if alive. The floor seemed to ripple underfoot, like the surface of a black lake. And in the center of the room stood a single object, an old rocking chair, its wood gleaming unnaturally. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until the chair began to move. Slowly, creakingly, it rocked back and forth, though there was no one there. Then came the whispers, soft, insidious, and impossibly close. "Welcome home," they said. The whispers continued, filling the air with a haunting cadence. They were indecipherable at first, a jumbled symphony of voices overlapping one another. But as I stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white, the words began to coalesce. Stay with us." My instinct screamed to slam the door shut and run, but I was rooted in place, hypnotized by the rhythmic creaking of the rocking chair and the eerie allure of the room. The flashlight beam flickered, casting jagged shadows across the shifting walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something else, a figure standing in the farthest corner of the room. It wasn't moving. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body was indistinct, as though it were made of smoke or shadows. But its eyes, they were unmistakable. Twin orbs of sickly yellow light, unblinking and fixed directly on me. A surge of adrenaline broke the spell. I stumbled back, yanking the door shut with a force that rattled the walls. My breathing came in ragged gasps, and my heart thundered in my chest as I collapsed against the opposite wall of the hallway. The whispers didn't stop. Even with the door closed, they seeped through the cracks, weaving themselves into the fabric of the house. I scrambled to my feet and fled downstairs, the sound of my hurried footsteps echoing through the house. In the living room, I tried to collect myself. My hands shook as I poured a glass of water from the old pitcher on the table, but I barely managed a sip before something caught my attention. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the ceiling. No, not the ceiling. Directly above me. It was the room. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, a background hum that seemed to follow me no matter where I went in the house. I tried leaving, grabbing my keys, and rushing to the front door. But when I opened it, the meadow outside was shrouded in an unnatural fog so dense it swallowed the headlights of my car. I turned back, feeling like a prisoner in my own inheritance. The next morning, I resolved to learn more about the house. Grandma's journal had been vague, but maybe there were other clues among her belongings. I spent hours digging through drawers, cupboards, and old chests in the attic. Eventually, I found something, a faded envelope tucked into the pages of an old photo album. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, its edges brittle with age. Written in my grandmother's delicate script was a chilling message. "The sixth room is not ours. It belongs to them. Do not disturb it. Do not let it out." Beneath the letter was a photograph. It was black and white, taken decades ago, but the subject was unmistakable. The sixth room. The strange patterns on the walls were just as I had seen them, and in the center of the frame was the rocking chair. But there was something else in the photograph, something I hadn't noticed in the room the night before. A figure stood next to the chair. It was the same tall, shadowy presence I had seen in the corner. Its head was tilted as though it were aware of the camera, and its eyes, even in the grainy photograph, they glowed with an otherworldly light. My hands trembled as I stared at the image. A memory surfaced, unbidden, a fragment from my childhood. I had once asked Grandma why she kept the upstairs hallway so dimly lit, why she avoided going near the far end. She had brushed off the question at the time, but now I understood. She had known. She had always known. That night, the whispers grew louder. They no longer confined themselves to the upstairs hallway. They seeped through the walls, threading their way into every corner of the house. Sometimes they called my name, other times they begged, "Come back, open the door." I tried to ignore them, barricading myself in the living room with the television blaring static to drown out the sound. But around midnight, the air shifted. It grew heavy, oppressive, and filled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The tapping started again, louder this time. I refused to look up, even as the sound grew insistent, almost frantic. Then came the voice, a deep, guttural tone that didn't belong to any human throat. "You can't hide." The temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen and twist. Slowly, against my will, my gaze was drawn to the ceiling. There, dangling upside down like a grotesque marionette, was a figure. Its elongated limbs stretched impossibly, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. The room filled with the sound of splintering wood as the ceiling fan above me began to spin wildly, the blades tearing through the air with a menacing hum. I bolted from the living room, my mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. The house felt alive, its walls breathing, its floor shifting beneath my feet. I stumbled up the stairs, back toward the cursed door, as if drawn by an invisible force. When I reached the hallway, I saw that the door was no longer hidden. It stood wide open, the black void beyond it pulsing like a beating heart. The rocking chair was empty now, but the whispers were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices beckoning me forward. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the threshold. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows inside the room writhed like living things. Just as I reached the doorway, a hand, cold and skeletal, emerged from the darkness and grasped my wrist. The whispers fell silent. The figure stepped forward, fully emerging from the room for the first time. It loomed over me, its presence suffocating, and spoke in a voice that was both many and one. "You've opened the door. Now you are ours." The figure's grip burned like ice, sending a shockwave of pain up my arm. I screamed and yanked myself free, stumbling backward into the hallway. My mind raced as the towering shadow advanced, its eyes glowing with malicious intent. The whispers returned, but now they were different, urgent, warning me rather than beckoning. "Run. Leave. Don't let it take you." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted down the stairs, heart hammering in my chest. The walls groaned around me, as if the house itself were trying to hold me back. Shadows spilled from the open door upstairs, pouring down the staircase in pursuit. I reached the front door and threw it open, hoping to escape into the night. But what greeted me wasn't the familiar meadow or the gravel driveway. Instead, I faced an expanse of impenetrable blackness, a void that stretched endlessly in every direction. The house was no longer in the world I knew. It had been swallowed by the presence in the sixth room. A chilling laugh echoed behind me. The shadowed figure was descending the stairs, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't need to rush. I had nowhere to go. Desperate, I darted into the kitchen, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My hands closed around a heavy cast iron skillet. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head throb. The figure entered the kitchen, its elongated form barely fitting through the doorway. It paused, as if savoring my fear, before lunging toward me. I swung the skillet with all my strength. The impact reverberated up my arm, but the shadow barely flinched. Instead, it lashed out with one of its impossibly long arms, sending me sprawling across the tiled floor. My vision blurred as I struggled to stand. That's when I noticed something strange. The mirror above the kitchen sink. Its surface was rippling, as though it were made of liquid rather than glass. Within it, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't mirroring my movements. Instead, it was pointing, gesturing toward the pantry door. The whispers shifted, their tone urgent. "Go! Hide!" With no other options, I obeyed. I scrambled to the pantry, slamming the door shut behind me. The confined space was pitch black, but I could hear the heavy footsteps of the shadowed figure as it searched the kitchen. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find me. The whispers filled the cramped space, louder than ever. You can't stay here. You must destroy it. The whispers began to form coherent instructions, guiding me to the back of the pantry. My trembling hands felt along the shelves until they closed around something cold and metallic. It was an old, rusted key, one I had never seen before. Upstairs, the whispers urged, "Lock the door. Seal it away." A crash outside the pantry made me flinch. The figurehead upended the kitchen table, its frustration evident. I knew it wouldn't be long before it found me. Clutching the key, I took a deep breath and prepared to make a run for it. With shaking hands, I inserted the key into the lock. The metal felt alive, vibrating against my fingers. The whispers crescendoed, their voices blending into a single, commanding roar. "Turn the key, now!" I twisted the key just as the figure lunged toward me. The door slammed shut, nearly taking my hand with it. A deafening roar filled the house as the shadows writhed and clawed at the sealed door. But the lock held firm. The oppressive weight in the air lifted. The whispers quieted, fading into a gentle hum before disappearing entirely. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. I sank to the floor, exhausted and battered. The house was still, its oppressive atmosphere replaced by an eerie calm. But as I sat there, clutching the key, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The sixth room was locked, but it wasn't gone. Whatever lurked inside was merely biding its time, waiting for the next fool to disturb it. And as I stared at the key in my hand, I realized with a sinking heart that it wasn't rusted anymore. It gleamed, polished and new, as though it had been waiting for someone else to use it. For weeks after the ordeal, I stayed away from my grandmother's house. I told her that I needed a break from the oppressive memories, and thankfully, she didn't question me. Life resumed a semblance of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the events of that night. The key was the worst part. I couldn't leave it behind, no matter how hard I tried. I placed it in a box, buried it in the woods, even tried throwing it into the river, but it always returned. I'd wake up to find it sitting on my bedside table, gleaming in the moonlight like a silent thread. The whispers returned, too, but now they were different. They weren't coming from the house anymore. They were coming from the key. I began researching the history of my grandmother's property, desperate for answers. Late nights at the library yielded fragments of information. Legends of the land being cursed, of settlers disappearing without a trace. Then, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article dated over a century ago. It detailed the story of a reclusive woman who had lived in the house. She was described as a keeper of a mysterious door that no one else could see. Her journals, which were partially recovered after her disappearance, hinted at a malevolent force bound to the property. One line stood out to me: the key chooses its guardian, but the guardian is only a pawn. The room can never truly be sealed. My blood ran cold. I wasn't just a victim. I had been chosen. The key had marked me as the next guardian, and there was no escaping it. That night, the whispers grew louder than ever, urging me to return to the house. "You have a duty. You must maintain the seal." I fought the pull with everything I had, but the whispers were relentless. They invaded my dreams, turning them into nightmares of the door bursting open, of the shadowed figure consuming everything I loved. By morning, I was too exhausted to resist. Clutching the cursed key, I drove back to my grandmother's house. The house seemed different as I approached it. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the once vibrant garden was now overgrown and wilted. My grandmother greeted me warmly, oblivious to the dark aura surrounding her home. I tried to act normal, but the whispers wouldn't let me. They guided me upstairs to the sixth room, where the door remained sealed. The lock pulsed faintly, as if alive, and the key in my hand seemed to vibrate in response. "You're not strong enough," the whispers said. "It's leaking through." I didn't know what they meant until I noticed the cracks. Tiny fissures snaked across the walls around the door, and from them seeped an inky darkness that writhed like living smoke. Desperate for answers, I tried confiding in my grandmother. I told her about the sixth room, the shadows, and the key. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss me. Instead, she grew pale, her hands trembling as she gripped her teacup. "I've known about the room," she admitted quietly. Your grandfather tried to seal it years ago, but he didn't make it." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why didn't you warn me?" She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I thought it was over. The door stayed locked for decades. I never thought." She trailed off, unable to finish. But I understood. The door wasn't just my burden. It was a curse that had plagued our family for generations. That night, the cracks around the door widened. The whispers turned into anguished cries, and the house trembled as if in pain. I could feel the shadow's presence pressing against the seal, trying to break free. The key grew hot in my pocket, almost burning me. The whispers gave me a choice: reinforce the seal, or let it out. I knew what letting it out would mean: chaos, destruction, death. But reinforcing the seal required a sacrifice. The whispers didn't specify what kind, but I had a sinking feeling I already knew. I stood before the door, key in hand, as the shadowed figure began to push through the cracks. Its glowing eyes peered at me, full of malice and hunger. The whispers guided me. "Insert the key. Give it what it needs." Tears streamed down my face as I slid the key into the lock. The house groaned, the walls trembling as the shadows coiled around me. My heart pounded as I whispered a silent apology to my grandmother, to my family. The lock clicked, and the room exploded with light. The shadows screamed, their forms twisting and writhing as they were sucked back into the door. The cracks sealed themselves, the house falling silent once more. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the hallway. The door was sealed, and the key was gone. Relief flooded through me, until I realized what was missing. The house was empty. My grandmother was gone. Her favorite chair sat untouched in the living room, her knitting basket beside it, but there was no trace of her. The whispers were silent, and the oppressive presence had lifted, but the cost was too high. I was alone, the sole guardian of a cursed door that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The weeks following my grandmother's disappearance felt like a slow descent into madness. Her absence was a void I couldn't fill, and the silence of the house was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper of the wind, felt like a ghostly reminder of what had been lost. The key was gone, but I could still feel its weight in my soul. The door, though sealed, was never truly out of my mind. I tried to leave the house, but something always drew me back. It wasn't just guilt, it was an invisible tether binding me to this place. And then the whispers returned. The whispers were different now. They weren't the menacing voices of the shadows, but softer, almost familiar. They guided me to the attic, a place I had avoided since I was a child. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs draped the rafters like ghostly veils. In the corner of the attic, beneath a pile of old blankets, I found a chest. It was heavy, made of dark wood, and locked with a rusted latch. Surprisingly, the keyhole seemed to match the cursed key that had haunted me. I didn't have the key anymore, but as I touched the latch, it clicked open, as if it recognized me. Inside were journals, photographs, and a series of letters. They were all written by my grandfather. The first journal detailed his discovery of the sixth room and his attempts to seal it. He wrote about the whispers, the shadows, and the sacrifices. He described the key choosing him, just as it had chosen me, and the toll it took on his sanity. But one entry stood out. The room is not just a portal, it's alive. It feeds on us, on our fears and pain. The key is its leash, and we are its keepers. But the leash is fraying, and I fear what will happen when it breaks. The more I read, the more I realized that the sixth room wasn't just a curse. It was a legacy. My grandfather had inherited it from his father, and his father before him. Each generation had been tasked with keeping the shadows contained, and each had paid a terrible price. But there was something else, a faint glimmer of hope buried in the pages. My grandfather mentioned a ritual, one that could potentially destroy the room forever. It required a specific set of conditions: the alignment of the moon, the spilling of ancestral blood, and a relic that had been hidden for generations. The relic was described as a pendant, a small, silver locket etched with strange symbols. According to the journal, it was hidden somewhere on the property, buried to keep it away from the shadows. The whispers guided me once again, this time to the overgrown garden behind the house. Armed with a shovel and a flashlight, I dug into the cold, damp earth. Hours passed, and frustration grew, but then my shovel struck something solid. I unearthed a small box. Its wood warped with age. Inside was the pendant, just as the journal had described. It was cold to the touch, and as I held it, the whispers ceased entirely. The oppressive presence that had loomed over the house lifted slightly, as if the relic held some kind of power over the shadows. But the relief was short-lived. The moment I stepped back into the house, the shadows stirred. The cracks around the sixth room's door returned, wider and darker than before. The pendant had angered them. That night, the shadows invaded my dreams. I saw visions of my ancestors, each standing before the sixth room's door, their faces etched with despair. My grandfather appeared, his eyes hollow but filled with urgency. He pointed to the pendant and then to the door, mouthing words I couldn't hear. When I woke, the pendant was glowing faintly, its light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, urging me to perform the ritual. I had no choice. The room was breaking free, and if I didn't act, it would consume everything. The ritual required several components, most of which were listed in my grandfather's journal. Salt, candles, and a mirror were easy enough to find, but the final ingredient, a drop of my blood, felt like a grim confirmation of my fate. The moon would align in 3 days, giving me just enough time to prepare. I spent those days in a haze of fear and determination, gathering the items and fortifying my resolve. The house grew darker with each passing night, the shadows pressing harder against the seal. On the final night, as the moon hung full and bright in the sky, I was ready. I stood before the sixth room's door, the pendant around my neck and the journal in my trembling hands. The air was thick with tension, and the walls groaned as if the house itself was alive. I spread a circle of salt around the door, placing the candles at each cardinal point. The mirror was positioned directly opposite the door, reflecting its dark surface back at itself. As I recited the incantation from the journal, the shadows erupted from the cracks, swirling violently around the room. The pendant burned against my chest, its light cutting through the darkness. The final step was the blood. With a deep breath, I pressed the tip of the knife to my palm, letting a single drop fall onto the pendant. The shadows screamed. The drop of my blood was the final key. The moment it touched the glowing pendant, a deafening roar filled the house, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The sixth room's door shuddered violently, the cracks around its edges expanding into gaping voids that oozed darkness. The pendant around my neck grew so hot I had to tear it away, flinging it onto the floor. Its light intensified, casting stark shadows that danced wildly along the walls. The shadows weren't retreating this time. They surged forward, pouring out from the sixth room like an unstoppable flood. I stumbled back, gripping the journal tightly. The words on the page seemed to shift and rearrange, revealing an additional verse I hadn't seen before. When the shadows take form, speak their name to bind them. But beware, names carry weight, and the wrong one will doom you. The shadows began to take shape. From the swirling darkness emerged a figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that glowed faintly red. Its presence was suffocating, and the air grew colder with every passing second. It didn't speak, but I could hear its voice inside my mind, a cacophony of whispers that overlapped and echoed. You have awakened us. You cannot undo what is done. The journal trembled in my hands, and I flipped frantically through the pages, searching for a clue. One name stood out, scrawled in the margins of an otherwise blank page: Arethea. I didn't know if it was the right name, but it was my only hope. I shouted the name with all the force I could muster. Arethea! The shadows recoiled, writhing as if struck by an invisible force. The figure let out an unearthly screech, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, I thought it was working, but then it laughed. The sound was low and guttural, shaking the very walls of the house. The shadows surged forward again, and the figure's voice echoed in my mind. "That is not my name. You have given me strength." Panic set in as I realized my mistake. The wrong name hadn't bound the entity, it had empowered it. The pendant, now lying on the floor, pulsed with a dim, desperate light, as if urging me to try again. I remember my grandfather's words. The room feeds on fear and pain. If fear was its fuel, then perhaps defiance could weaken it. Gathering what little courage I had left, I stepped forward, forcing myself to meet the figure's hollow gaze. "You don't control me," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "This is my house, my bloodline, and you don't belong here." The figure hesitated, its form flickering again. The shadows slowed their advance, swirling uncertainly around my feet. Taking advantage of the moment, I grabbed the pendant and held it high. Its light flared brighter, and the shadows shrank back further. The journal in my other hand began to glow faintly, the words on the pages rearranging once more. A new name emerged, written in bold, fiery script: Azeroth. I didn't hesitate this time. "Azeroth!" I shouted, pouring every ounce of strength and determination into the name. The figure froze, its hollow eyes widening in what could only be described as fear. The shadows screamed, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke that were drawn back into the sixth room. The pendant burned so brightly it was blinding, and the door began to close on its own, the cracks around its ceiling as if they had never existed. The figure let out one final, ear-piercing wail before dissolving into nothingness. The room's door slammed shut with a thunderous boom, and the pendant shattered into a million tiny shards. The house fell silent. For the first time in years, it felt normal. The oppressive weight that had lingered in every corner was gone, and the air felt lighter. I sank to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The journal lay open beside me, its pages blank once more. Whatever force had guided me through this ordeal had completed its purpose. But as I stared at the sealed door, a nagging thought crept into my mind. The room was closed, but was it truly gone? Or was it merely waiting, biding its time for the next generation? Days passed, and life began to resemble something close to normal. The oppressive energy of my grandmother's house seemed to have dissipated, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. The sixth room's door remained sealed, and I felt an almost superstitious reluctance to go near it. I focused on repairing the parts of the house that had been damaged during the ordeal. The shattered windows, the claw marks etched into walls, and the scorch marks that trailed along the floorboards. But as I worked, small anomalies started to creep back into my life. The ceiling fan in the living room began spinning on its own. The television flickered between static and old home videos that I didn't recognize. And late at night, I thought I heard faint whispers coming from the direction of the sixth room. It started subtly, a distant hum, like wind rustling through the trees. But as the days went on, the whispers grew more distinct. They didn't call my name this time. Instead, they repeated a single phrase over and over. "You only delayed us." The word sent chills down my spine. Whatever I had done, it wasn't permanent. I had disrupted the room's influence, but its essence still lingered, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I considered leaving the house altogether, but something compelled me to stay. It wasn't just my stubbornness or a sense of unfinished business. It was the house itself. I felt tethered to it, as if my bloodline and its secrets wouldn't let me go. One night, unable to sleep, I returned to the journal. I had assumed it was empty after the confrontation with the entity, but now, faint text began to appear on its yellowed pages. The new entry read, "To banish what was summoned is not enough. The door must be destroyed. But beware, the destruction of the door is the destruction of the tether." The tether. The word sent a chill through me. Was the house itself the tether? Or was it something within me, my bloodline? I flipped through the journal frantically, searching for more clues. The text continued to manifest, scrawling itself in hurried, chaotic handwriting. The tether can only be severed at great cost. Blood called it forth. Blood must seal it away forever. My chest tightened as the implication sank in. To destroy the sixth room meant sacrificing something, or someone. That night, I woke to find my grandmother sitting at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was a dream. Her figure was translucent, her expression unreadable, but the cold radiating from her presence felt real enough to freeze me in place. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice a mixture of sorrow and anger. "You should have left this place to rot." I sat up, my heart racing. "I came back because I had to. No one else would deal with this." She shook her head, her ghostly features twisting in anguish. "You don't understand. The house isn't a home, it's a prison. And the sixth room is the lock." Her words struck a chord. "Then why did you stay here your entire life? Why did you let it consume you?" Tears shimmered in her spectral eyes. "Because someone had to. Every generation. Someone must guard the tether, or the door will open again, and the world won't survive what comes through." Her form began to flicker, and she reached out, her cold hand passing through mine. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently. "You have a choice. You can leave and let the house claim someone else, or you can stay and sever the tether for good." "How?" I demanded. "How do I sever it?" Her voice faded as her form dissolved into mist. "You already know the answer." And then she was gone. Over the next few days, the house grew increasingly hostile. The whispers turned to screams, objects flew across rooms, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. It was as if the house itself was trying to drive me out, desperate to protect its secret. But I refused to leave. I spent hours in the library, scouring the journal and other forgotten texts for a solution. The journal hinted at a ritual, one that required blood, fire, and sacrifice. But the details were vague, as if whoever had written it feared revealing too much. One phrase stood out, written in bold, jagged letters. "The sixth room cannot be opened, but it can be destroyed." Armed with this knowledge, I began gathering what I would need: salt, candles, and an old sledgehammer I found in the basement. I poured a ring of salt around the sixth room's door, lighting candles at each corner. The pendant's shattered shards were gathered into a small pouch, which I tied around my neck like an amulet. The ritual called for fire, so I soaked a bundle of wood in gasoline and placed it at the base of the door. As I worked, the house fought back with increasing ferocity. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, and the air was filled with a cacophony of screams and laughter. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The final step of the ritual required a drop of my blood to ignite the fire. But the journal's warnings echoed in my mind. The destruction of the door is the destruction of the tether. I hesitated, the knife trembling in my hand. If the tether was severed, would the house collapse? Would I survive? And then, as if in answer, the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Do it. End this." I pressed the blade to my palm, letting a single drop of blood fall onto the gasoline-soaked wood. The moment my blood touched the gasoline-soaked wood, a surge of energy exploded through the room. The candle's flames elongated, twisting into jagged spirals as the salt ring shimmered with a faint, otherworldly light. The bundle of wood ignited instantly, flames licking hungrily at the base of the sixth room's door. But the fire wasn't natural. The flames were a deep crimson, pulsating as if alive. Shadows writhed within them, taking on vaguely humanoid shapes that clawed and stretched toward me. The house roared in protest. The floor shook violently, cracks splintering across the walls and ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and something far fouler, an acrid stench that stung my eyes and throat. I stumbled backward, shielding my face from the heat. But no matter how far I moved, the fire seemed to follow, its oppressive heat pressing against my skin. The entity from the void began to push its way through, its form shifting and twisting like smoke in a storm. Its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. I grabbed the sledgehammer, my only weapon, and swung it at the entity's clawed hand. The impact sent a ripple through its form, but it only seemed to enrage it further. The house came alive in its defense. Furniture flew across the room, walls cracked and buckled, and the floor beneath me began to split open, revealing more of the void. I fought to keep my balance, swinging the sledgehammer wildly at anything that moved. The entity's whispers turned to screams, its voice echoing in my mind. You cannot destroy what you are bound to. The journal's words echoed in my mind. Blood called it forth. Blood must seal it away forever. I realized then what had to be done. My grandmother had tried to warn me, but I hadn't understood. The tether wasn't just the sixth room or the house. It was me. The entity's claws slashed through the air, narrowly missing me as I stumbled back toward the fire. I clutched the pouch of shattered pendant shards around my neck, feeling their sharp edges dig into my skin. With trembling hands, I opened the pouch and poured the shards into the flames. The fire roared to life once more, burning brighter and hotter than before. The entity shrieked, its form retreating slightly as the flames surged toward it. But it wasn't enough. The void was still open, its pull growing stronger by the second. I knew what I had to do. Clutching the knife, I stepped into the fire. Pain erupted through my body as the flames consumed me, but I didn't stop. I plunged the knife into my chest, letting my blood flow freely onto the fire. The effect was immediate. The flames turned white-hot, their light piercing through the void and banishing the shadows. The entity screamed, its form disintegrating into ash as the void began to collapse in on itself. The house shook violently, the walls and ceiling crumbling as the sixth room was consumed by the fire. As the void closed, I felt myself slipping away. The pain faded, replaced by a strange, comforting warmth. I saw my grandmother's face, her expression one of sadness and relief. You did it, she whispered. You freed us, and then there was nothing but darkness. I awoke to silence. At first, I thought I was dead. My body felt weightless, suspended in an endless void. But as my senses returned, I realized I was lying on solid ground. The scent of burnt wood and ash filled the air, and the faint crackle of dying flames echoed around me. I opened my eyes and found myself in the ruins of my grandmother's house. The walls were blackened, the roof had caved in, and the sixth room was gone, obliterated as though it had never existed. But I was still here. The knife was gone, the wound in my chest healed, and yet I could feel something different inside me. A part of the void had left its mark, a faint whisper in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. As I stumbled through the wreckage, I heard voices. Faint at first, then growing louder. They weren't the sinister whispers of the void, but familiar ones, my family. I turned and saw them standing in the ashes of the sixth room. My grandmother, my father, my aunt. They were all there, their faces serene, yet tinged with sorrow. You freed us, my grandmother said, her voice echoing with a strange resonance. The house no longer holds us captive. You've severed the tether. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I'm sorry, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't understand what I was walking into. My grandmother stepped closer, her form shimmering like a mirage. It wasn't your fault. The house chose you because of the bond we shared. It wanted to keep the cycle going, but you broke it. You gave us peace. As she spoke, the other spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke. My grandmother lingered for a moment longer, her gaze softening. Live your life, child, she said. And remember, the past doesn't define you. With that, she too vanished, leaving me alone in the ruins. In the days that followed, I tried to move on. The house was condemned, its remains bulldozed to the ground. I returned to the city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the whispers didn't leave me. At night, I would hear them, soft and insistent, calling my name from the corners of my apartment. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and sometimes I felt the faint brush of cold fingers against my skin. I pored over the journal again, searching for answers. There was a passage I had overlooked before, scrawled hastily in the margins. The void cannot be destroyed. It can only be contained. A part of it will always remain, seeking a way back. I realized then that the fight wasn't over. The tether was broken, but the void still had a hold on me. I began to prepare. If the void wanted to reclaim me, it wouldn't happen without a fight. I studied everything I could find about banishment rituals, protection sigils, and wards against dark entities. The whispers grew louder with each passing day, the shadows darker and more oppressive. The void was closing in, and I knew I didn't have much time. One night, as I sat surrounded by candles and protective sigils, the air in my apartment grew heavy. The temperature dropped, and the whispers coalesced into a single, deafening voice. "You belong to us?" The shadows erupted from the walls, forming a swirling vortex in the center of the room. The entity from the sixth room emerged, its form more solid and menacing than before. This time, I was ready, armed with a blade inscribed with protective runes and a vial of blessed water. I faced the entity head-on. The battle was fierce, the apartment shaking as the void's presence clashed with my defenses. Every incantation I uttered seemed to weaken the entity, but it wasn't enough. The void's pull was too strong, its hunger insatiable. In a desperate move, I drew a sigil in my own blood, just as I had done in my grandmother's house. The sigil flared to life, its light blinding and pure. The entity shrieked, its form unraveling as the sigil's power consumed it. But the victory came at a cost. The sigil's light enveloped me, and I felt myself being pulled into the void. The light from the blood-drawn sigil burned brighter than anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't just blinding, it was all-consuming. The world around me dissolved into an infinite blackness, streaked with flashes of chaotic energy. I wasn't simply standing in the void, I was a part of it now. The whispers became a roar, every voice that had ever called to me in the shadows converging into a deafening cacophony. They weren't just calling my name anymore, they were telling me what I was. You are ours. You are the tether. You cannot escape. But amidst the chaos, I felt a strange calm. Something my grandmother had said lingered in my mind. The past doesn't define you. If I was a part of the void now, that also meant I could manipulate it. I focused, forcing myself to see through the chaos. The swirling shadows and fragmented whispers began to coalesce, forming a shape, an entity larger and older than anything I could comprehend. It was the void itself, not just a fragment of its power, but its true form. It was vast and endless, its essence stretching across dimensions. And it was angry. "You think you can defy me?" The void hissed, its voice shaking the fabric of my very being. "You are nothing but a speck, a flicker of light that I will extinguish." But I wasn't afraid anymore. The sigil I had drawn in my blood was still burning, its light carving a path through the void's endless expanse. I reached for it, feeling its energy resonate within me. The sigil wasn't just a symbol of protection, it was a gateway, a means of controlling the void, of bending its power to my will. I drew another sigil in the air, this one more intricate and precise. The void recoiled, its form rippling as the sigil's light expanded. "You cannot contain me," it roared, but its voice was weaker now, its power wavering. For the first time, I realized the truth. The void wasn't invincible. It was ancient and vast, yes, but it wasn't omnipotent. It thrived on fear and submission, and I refused to give it either. As the sigil's power grew, I felt my own strength fading. The void was tied to me now, and severing that connection would require more than a simple spell. I had to give something up, something essential. Memories of my family flashed before me. My grandmother's laugh, my father's stories, the warmth of my childhood home. These were the ties that had bound me to the void, the echoes of a legacy steeped in darkness. I closed my eyes and whispered a single word, release. The memories began to fade, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The pain was excruciating, but I held firm. The sigil flared one last time, its light expanding until it consumed everything. The void screamed, its form shattering into countless fragments. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the ruins of my grandmother's house. The sun was rising, its light casting long shadows across the debris. The whispers were gone. The shadows no longer moved of their own accord. The void's presence had been banished, its tether severed once and for all. But I wasn't the same. My memories were fragmented, pieces of my past missing like torn pages from a book. I couldn't remember my grandmother's face, nor the sound of her voice. The house felt like a stranger to me, its significance lost. Yet, I felt free.